Hello, my name is Tyler, and this is part 1 of 3 in my series detailing the Spanish Civil War. But before we get started, here are some important facts about the war. First, the Spanish Civil War was a 3-year conflict starting July 17th of 1936 through April 1st of 1939. Secondly, even though there were two sides of the war, they were not very clearly defined. What do I mean by this? Well, for example, the overarching Republican side of the war included communist supporters and volunteers, anarchists from near the Barcelona region, and the pre-existing government. And number 3, this is a completely objective standpoint, as I'm not saying one side or the other had better ideals. To start the story of La Guerra Civil Española, we have to look into why it started in the first place. To say that the government before the war was unstable would be a big understatement. Let's start in the year of 1868, where Queen Isabella II is overthrown in the proclaimed Glorious Revolution, and she is sent to exile into Paris. The revolution starts the 6 revolutionary years, which includes a provisional government, which was thrown out when King Amadeo I took power, and the abdication of Amadeo saw the rise of Spain's First Republic. The Republic would last for 9 months, using the most progressive constitution in Europe at this time, and ended with the restoration of the Bourbons, which lifted Alfonso XII to the throne. Alfonso XII would soon die in 1885 after a relatively uneventful rule, and he was succeeded by his posthumous child, Alfonso XIII. At the age of just 12, during his mother's regency, Spain lost the colonial possessions of Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Cuba in the Spanish-American War. First World War. The early 1900s were filled with reforms and suppressing rebellions. After the disaster in 1898, Morocco was now the main focus of the Spanish army, and 76,000 of 140,000 troops were stationed there right before the First World War. As World War I broke out, Spain remained neutral, and would remain so for the rest of the war. King Alfonso would visit battlefield sites personally, and he felt obliged to provide humanitarian aid to both sides of the war. The Spanish economy boomed during these times, and there was now more focus put into the arms and textile industries. Spain also paid off almost all of their national debt during World War I. In the later stages of the war, King Alfonso protested the use of German U-boats and sent diplomatic protests to Germany after Kaiser Wilhelm declared his doctrine of unrestricted submarine warfare. In the entire war, Spain would lose a total of 140,000 tons of shipping to the German U-boats. Tensions were growing in Morocco, and by 1920 there were frequent guerrilla attacks against Spanish fortifications. The area targeted by the strikes was the Rif, a mountainous region in northern Morocco that was home to many indigenous Berber tribesmen, many led by Abd el-Krim. These attacks slowly became a frontal offensive of el-Krim's forces, and the first battle of the war was at Anual. Spanish troops under Manuel Silvestre made a quick decision to retreat from the frontline fortifications. The Spanish troops were panicked as the Riffian forces seized the initiative and pushed the Spanish troops back to the coastal city of Melilla, with the Spanish death toll from 8 to 10,000. No one could believe the news when it was relayed back to the mainland, and when it was confirmed by the government, there was outrage. After what is now known as the disaster of Anuel, there were many investigations into current colonial military systems, and it showed poor military leadership, low troop morale, bad logistics on the front line, and dysfunctional equipment. In 1923, a high-ranking army officer named Miguel Primo de Rivera overthrew the Spanish government with support of the king and army. The reason behind the coup was written in a manifesto, and it was supposedly so they could get rid of the corruption in the government. And much of the coup was inspired by Mussolini's overthrow of Italy. Going back to the war in the Rif, there were big losses in Morocco, and one of the biggest losses was the massacre of Monte Arouit. After 12 days of the Riffians sieging the fortifications, the high-ranking General Navarro inside negotiated for surrender, but the Riffians would not meet their end of the deal, and massacred around 2,000 Spanish soldiers, as around 400 to 600 were used for ransom. In 1923, Abd el-Krim declared independence for the Republic of the Rif and adopted a Muslim legal code and a central bureaucracy. In 1925, el-Krim possessed three-fourths of all the Moroccan protectorate. Stalemate in the Spanish Morocco lasted for a few years, and then in 1925, Abd el-Krim made a surprise attack on French Morocco. France suffered above 5,000 casualties from these opening attacks, and most posts were abandoned very quickly. France and Spain soon made delegations for a military pact against the Rif, and soon they would try to make an amphibious landing at Al Husaymas Bay. The date of the landing would be in September of 1925, and the Riffians were no match to fight the two European powers after the landing. Abd el-Krim would surrender on May 27th of 1926, and Spanish casualties for the whole war totaled 43,000. Going back to the mainland, Primo de Rivera, throughout his reign as dictator, attempted to improve and promote the industry and economy of Spain, but ultimately failed, leading to his lurid popularity and resignation in 1930. The majority vote in 1933 was won by the Spanish Confederation of the Autonomous Right, also known as SEDA, but the current president, Niceto Alcalá Zamora, declined and instead invited the leader of the far-left Radical Republican Party. Many changes in the Republican Party had caused many small-scale insurrections in northern Spain, although there was a big uprising in Asturias, where 30,000 workers that were mostly miners took control of the province. During the insurrection, the workers burned down religious buildings and killed policemen, clergymen, and other civilians. The war minister, Diego Hidalgo, wanted to send General Francisco Franco to disperse the strikes, but the president noted his monarchist sympathies and sent General Lopez instead. Many troops from the Army of Africa were brought in, including other government troops, and killed men, women, and children, civilian casualties totaling more than 1,000 before it was fully dispersed. Azaña, the prime minister during this time, was organizing the Popular Front of Spain, which was a coalition of all the left-wing parties. The new front would soon win the election of 1936, and Azaña was elected president in May. While this was happening, the right-wing groups were grouping too, and monarchists continued to prepare, which most of them turned to the Spanish Phalange, which was under the leadership of Miguel Primo de Rivera's son, José Primo de Rivera. Seda would continue to almost copy the fascist movements going on in Nazi Germany now, and also in Italy. Seda would later give their campaign chest to an army plotter, Emilio Mora, who had many doubts about the revolution that he would soon lead. To delay the plotting in the military, the current government assigned disliked posts to high-ranking officers, such as Franco having a post in the Canary Islands, Mullah was moved to Navarro, and another member, Juan Yagüe, was moved to Morocco. The military coup, despite all attempts to block it, was started at 5 a.m. on the 17th of July, 1936. You must sacrifice every thought, every ideology, for the good of the nation and for the serenity of our fatherhood. Francisco Franco.